Warner Bros. Games are an intriguing bunch as far as publishers go, because they preside over a variety of studios with a very diverse collection of intellectual property, and yet they've not really done a whole lot with it recently. They generally have just been quiet in recent years outside of a small enough handful of projects, but this year, they decided that it was time for their first ever full E3 press conference. Of course, those plans have since derailed, but I think you get the point. So, before the almost inevitable all-digital showcase actually happens, we've got to ask, just what is going on with Warner Bros. Games? Now, as always, if you want to support us, especially these sort of deep dive videos, and get some cool stuff in return, Patreon is the place. Our loot tier is mega chunky this month. We've got these prints. This is key art from a week-long prototype game sprint our team did, so that's also in it. Plus, of course, the Paladin pin, the Tiefling art pack, whole bunch of stuff. There's also the daily briefing, your daily news TLDR post, which you can conveniently get via email if you config Patreon just right. So, thanks to the patrons for making the more research-heavy, sort of non-breaking news videos that are interesting but don't get mega views, like this one, possible. We really appreciate it. Thank you for giving us the chance to actually do things like this. And with that said, let's get going. A question you might be asking yourself at this point is, why exactly do Warner Brothers matter? And to be honest, in asking that question, you totally have a point. They have not done a whole lot these last few years and are perhaps most notable for, being kind of a shining beacon of bad microtransaction practices, basically. Indeed, the gaming division almost seems to be forgotten even by Warner Brothers themselves, though that might just be due to their very messy corporate structure and the sheer scale. So, WB Games are a subsidiary of Warner Brothers Home Entertainment, right? And they are one of the 4 WarnerMedia business units. But it actually goes further because WarnerMedia themselves are under the vast umbrella of AT&T. Now, Warner Bros., it was mentioned once in the latest earnings call, and no future investor calls will focus on WB Games as a publisher, even though they actually seem to have quite grand ambitions and wanted to unveil a lot this year. So, why do they matter? Well, this year the publisher planned to hold a full E3 presentation for the first time in their history, so they obviously believed, right, that they had something to show off, and that very well may be the case. Rumor actually has it that the conference would have showcased a new Batman game from their Montreal studio, then the next project from the Arkham developers Rocksteady Studios, and then the open-world Harry Potter title that actually leaked a couple of years back, but we of course haven't really seen. Now, there was speculation that that Batman title would be more of a reboot of the whole thing, and there were rumors that the Court of Bats would be the villains and the sort of Bat family would be featured, so maybe expanding it out a little bit more. And then, of course, there's also Back 4 Blood. This is a Left 4 Dead spiritual successor by Turtle Rock, the original devs, and that was announced back in March of 2019. So perhaps whatever showcase they would have been planning to have given us for E3 would have had all of those things, which certainly would make sense because this would be a time where, their pipeline would have aligned such as they would have loads of announcements to make, which could make a lot of sense in light of it almost being next-gen time. Now, recent changes, basically, in their monetization models they've kind of served to recoup a little bit of their image, but only for the people who really stuck around. So the latest Mortal Kombat, its recent Afterlife update, showed more of a move towards expansions over the typical nickel and diming DLC models that we've seen in the past and can be quite common in that genre. It's even got RoboCop for some reason, I guess. Now, they may have a ways to go yet when it comes to salvaging their reputation, I'd say especially with PC gamers though. WB Games have historically had a pretty terrible track record on PC. Like the Shadow of games were pretty good, but like Arkham Knight, that was infamous for being an utter travesty, and the franchise was already in pretty thin ice after Arkham Origins just limped out of the gate. And then of course Mortal Kombat had a rough launch, it quickly racked up the dreaded mostly negative user review tag on Steam after widespread performance issues, really grindtastic progression, worries over microtransactions as well, and just a sort of a weird, questionable direction there. So it was a rough period for them. And with all of that said, well, what do Warner Brothers games have beyond just a few rumors, for like a now cancelled June showcase? Well, the publisher oversees a lot of studios, and there's a wealth of intellectual property. So Avalanche Studios were rescued in 2017 following the shuttering of Disney Interactive. Yep, Disney just said, video games? Nah, we're axing them. Now, they, of course, earned acclaim for their family-friendly titles like Disney Infinity, and Avalanche are allegedly behind the open-world Harry Potter title that has been knocking around, still unannounced, of course, since, reportedly, 2018. So, there's them. There's then, of course, Monolith Productions, a well-known, mostly very respected dev. They did Fear, they did Condemned, they did the recent Middle-earth Shadow of something series. Their last game, of course, was Shadow of War in 2017, which, despite releasing to resounding critical success, which really prompted a lot of people being confused about the critics, mostly prompted user complaints because, the monetization was so bad it ruined the core of the game. And because of that, Monolith actually essentially had to rework it 6 months later. But of course, I think by that stage, the damage was done, even though that's a game that probably did have a very good core to it. So certainly if their next project replicates those mistakes, I'd be impressed, but not in a good way. Now, they have been quiet on the next project, but we do know that it is going to be an open world game, but that doesn't really tell us that much. So we could see a third Shadow of game. I think that would be a safe bet. They actually still hold the license, so I'd say that would be good. Now, it was actually believed that Warner Brothers had lost the license last year after Lego Hobbit and Lord of the Rings games were abruptly delisted from Steam, though they actually returned last month with just as little explanation. Now, Warner Brothers are also involved with the Lord of the Rings television show that is currently in the works for Amazon, so that IP link is still there, right? If they wanted to, forge another game, they will, of course, have to be careful, though some players still have not forgotten the state of Shadow of War, how it actually launched, and that is just going to loom over them. Next, then, we've got Netherrealm Studios. They are perhaps the most relevant here, I would say, and they've been having a decent time after a rough time, right? So Mortal Kombat, the recent one, it launched kind of pretty badly, right? But it has been more successful after that. So much so that there's no pressing need for a sequel, and the team is instead exploring the narrative expansion that we discussed earlier, which does sound pretty good. Now, the game's creative director, Ed Boon, last year expressed some hope at being able to branch out, right, with the series. So maybe this Afterlife expansion and the narrative side of it is the first step in them actually achieving that goal. Now, there is still improvement to be made elsewhere, though, right, with this studio, because the other thing going on is they were notorious for having a pretty toxic workplace environment and just, the brutality kills, meaning that staff would have to be spending a lot of time looking at some really, really, really horrible stuff. And, that's the sort of thing that it is a bit gnarly. Like, my dad actually got a little bit of frostbite when he was doing a marathon. He's done one on the North Pole and Antarctica. He's a madman. But, the first game that our studio was doing, that's set not actually in Antarctica. It's sort of AU, but basically, right? And, when we were doing the art for that, yeah, we had to look, what are freeze burns like in the face? There was our artists who were looking at lots of, meat in not that good conditions, right? And some real gnarly stuff. And at that point, especially with a few of the narrative elements that we have that are a little bit more sort of hardcore and a bit oof, we had to be very sure that we were giving people the appropriate support and space if they wanted to move off that stuff. Because it turns out if you're going in 9 to 5 and you're looking at frostbite wounds, sort of just the crazy stuff that can happen in a setting like the one we're going for, it can have an effect on people. And certainly for the stuff they would be looking at for a Mortal Kombat game, given how, brutality very much, they certainly are brutality, so that's an interesting thing. Now, since the initial article that was talking about that, we basically haven't heard that much information, so who knows as to whether their work culture has changed or if they've implemented any new practices there. What else then? Well, Rocksteady Studios, who were acquired by Warner Brothers in 2010 following the acclaimed Batman Arkham Asylum, well, they went on to, of course, find success with the rest of that trilogy and sort of redefine elements of what those third-person action games really played like. Now, they've been quiet since 2015's Arkham Knight, though their next project was slated to be revealed at E3 this year. Some cancelled projects have also surfaced recently, though, such as a concept art from what was supposedly a Batman game that never actually actually got, or a Superman game even that never actually got off the ground. So there's that sort of stuff going on. And speaking of cancelled projects, well, that's when we're going to go up and take a look at Warner Brothers Games Montreal. They axed a multiplayer Suicide Squad game back in 2016. Not much was actually known about that project beyond the fact that it was in development for 2 years before it ultimately failed to impress Warner Brothers management. So that was going on. It was actually never even formally announced either, so just a project that didn't get off the ground. Then Warner Brothers Games Montreal also reportedly shifted their attention over to an Arkham successor, which itself is now presumed cancelled. And it's kind of rough for that studio because despite being formed back in 2010, WB Games Montreal's body of work consists entirely of Batman Arkham Origins, a failed LEGO MMO called Legends of Chima, and some Arkham Knight DLC. So it's a bit rough. Now, they have been teasing a new Batman title since September of last year, and recently they asked fans to stay tuned for more details, so I would expect to be seeing some form of announcement over the coming summer. We then got Traveler's Tales, who became TT Games in 2005 following the acquisition of Giant Entertainment. Now, that also earned them the exclusive license for LEGO properties. TT Games was then purchased by Warner Brothers in 2007, and of course that meant that, well, they ended up basically bringing those rights over with a part of the deal, and that means that Warner Brothers can create and publish games based on any IP that LEGO has a license for, regardless of whether Warner Brothers themselves have access to that IP. So that's why Warner Brothers, they can't do a Star Wars game, but they can do LEGO Star Wars, even though, of course, EA have the license to Star Wars games. So yeah, LEGO Star Wars, the Skywalker saga, that is going to be out towards the end of this year. A recent trailer suggested October, but that trailer was removed, so a specific date is very much still up in the air. And that release will encompass all 9 Star Wars movies in what will undoubtedly be their most ambitious project. And you know what? Those games, for what they are, they're actually pretty great, so fair enough, actually. Now, after that, it's anyone's guess, but I would imagine they would be sticking to LEGO. Then, aside from a few Warner Brothers mobile teams in Boston and New York, the last notable studio is IO Interactive. Now, having been axed by Square Enix in 2017, IO retained the rights to Hitman via a successful buyout strategy. They partnered with Warner Brothers for Hitman 2, and the two signed a publishing deal for a new console and PC game experience in October of last year. Now, the Hitman reboot is due to be a trilogy, and the third game is in production, though this new IP, well, that does remain a mystery for now. But that said, I really like what that studio makes, so I'm pretty interested. The partnership has been a successful one for both parties, so you do have to just wonder whether Warner Brothers will then branch out with similar deals for other studios. I mean, their move with Turtle Rock on Back 4 Blood, that does suggest that they could be opening up a little bit more to third-party publishing, right? So not just studios that they wholly own. Now, in presenting this series, we've come to notice a couple of common factors across the industry today. And one of the most prominent is just, games publishers, right? These companies sitting on gold mines of IP and potential projects and kind of doing little with them. I mean, look at Activision starting to do the remakes of their Spyros and Crashes. And Warner Brothers Games is a striking example of this stuff, just because, the licenses that they have, because it's Warner Brothers, right? It's such a diverse amount of IP that they would have access to. But, they don't really use that much of it, right? They could do so much more than, Lego Batman, and, the Shadow of stuff. It seems like they've kind of struggled to deliver. But that said, there was what they wanted to do in this June, right? It could just be that they simply have too much IP and not enough studios to actually know what to do with it all, but the fact that they were planning to hold that E3 conference this year does suggest that they may finally have gotten a handle on their catalog, maybe on their gaming ambitions. With Mortal Kombat and its new expansion already out there and seemingly doing just fine, admittedly after a rough launch, and a new LEGO Star Wars title probably going to be coming out before the end of the year, an E3 announcement of new titles, right, and the Batman, maybe Harry Potter licenses, that certainly would have rounded out this year quite nicely for them and set them up for a lot more future success. Beyond that, though, they do have new IP from Rocksteady and IO Interactive, along with IO's new Hitman, plus whatever Monolith are working on. So there's still no word, right, on when we'll actually see any of these projects. This is so up in the air. But, you know, we've been kind of assuming that Warner Brothers will make like the rest of the industry and, you know, hold their own digital showcase to actually replace E3, but that has actually not been confirmed yet or announced or anything like that. But they are, that said, listed as a participant in Jeff Keighley's Summer Games Fest, though, so we could get some stuff there. Overall, I'd say after a few rough years across their different studios, Warner Brothers could set themselves up for a pretty smooth future, and they could have a development pipeline to actually make some other companies envious. They've got great IP, they've got great studios, it's just a matter of whether they can actually execute on those projects. And hopefully they do. They do have great IP. They have put out really great games in the past. It's a pity they've sort of sabotaged a bunch of them with microtransactions like with Shadow of War, but if the lesson has been learned there, maybe things could go pretty well. So there you go, that is it. That is our dive into the state of Warner Bros. Games. Of course, the next state of video, I believe, is actually up on Patreon right now, and there's a whole bunch of other goodies there, including you can get this delicious art from our studio. So lots of fun stuff going on here. Thank you very much for your support in this video. Be sure to like, sub, all that good stuff, and I will see you next time.